continuing Cleomenes from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. The land was divided, and every one that he had banished had a share assigned him, for he promised to restore all as soon as things were settled and in quiet, and in completing the number of citizens out of the best and most promising of the country people, he raised a body of 4,000 men, and instead of the spear taught them how to use a sarissa with both hands, and to carry their shields by a band and not by a handle, as before. After this he began to consult about the education of the youth, and the discipline, as they called it, most of the particulars of which Sphaurus, being then at Sparta, assisted in arranging, and in a short time the schools of exercise and the common tables recovered their ancient decency and order, a few out of necessity, but the most voluntarily, returning to that generous and laconic way of living, and that the name of monarch might give them no jealousy, he made Euclides his brother partner in the throne, and that was the only time that Sparta had two kings in the same family. Then, understanding that the Achaeans and Aretas imagined that this change had disturbed and shaken his affairs, and that he would not venture out of Sparta and leave the city now unsettled in the midst of so great an alteration, he thought it great and serviceable to his designs to show his enemies the zeal and forwardness of his troops, and therefore, making an incursion into the territories of Megalopolis, he wasted the country far and wide, and collected considerable booty, and at last, taking a company of actors as they were traveling from Messene, and building a theatre in the enemy's country, and offering a prize of 40 mina in value, he sat spectator a whole day. Not that he either desired or needed such amusement, but wishing to show his disregard for his enemies, and by a display of his contempt to prove the extent of his superiority to them. For this alone of all Greek or royal armies had no stage players, no jugglers, no dancing or singing women attending it, but was free from all sorts of looseness, wantonness, and festivity. Well, that is how Muhammad won at least one battle, is the people came out there with the non-soldiers dancing and singing and playing music and all that sort of stuff, and factored in towards their losing. The young men being, for the most part, at their exercises, and the old man giving them lessons, are at leisure times diverting themselves with their native jests and quick Laconian answers, the good results of which we have noticed in the life of Lycurgus. He himself instructed all by his example. He was a living pattern of temperance before every man's eyes, and his course of living was neither more stately nor more expensive, nor in any way more pretentious than that of his people, and this was a considerable advantage to him in his designs on Greece, for men, when they waited upon other kings, did not so much admire their wealth, costly furniture, and numerous attendants, as they hated their pride and state, their difficulty of access, and imperious answers to their addresses. And honestly, as much as there's lifestyles, the rich and famous and all that stuff, I think that before I was even born, it was the thing that people actually have more hatred and opposition to these celebrities than they do, oh sure, people tend to pick a few, my favorite actor or actress, whether they can actually act or not, or whether they're any better as a musician than any others. Like I can think of people who could both act and play music better than most of the people out there at the top of the game, but they weren't chosen. And it's not just jealousy that people, the rich and famous and all that stuff. It's like, no, that's not entirely it either. Well, there is some of that amongst the people who are, think they deserve, go around thinking they just deserve such, but but when they came to Cleomenes, who was both really a king and bore that title, and saw no purple, no robes of state upon him, no couches and litters about him for his ease, and that he did not receive requests and return answers after a long delay and difficulty, though a number of messengers and doorkeepers are by memorials that he rose and came forward in any dress he might happen to be wearing to meet those that came to wait upon him, stayed, talked freely and affably with all that had business. They were extremely taken and won to his service, and professed that he alone was the true son of Hercules. His common everyday meal was in an ordinary room, very sparing and after the laconic manner, and when he entertained ambassadors or strangers, 2 more couches were added, and a little better dinner provided by his servants, but no savouring sauces or sweetmeats, only the dishes were larger, and the wine more plentiful. For he reproved one of his friends for entertaining some strangers with nothing but barley bread and black broth, such a diet as they usually had in their fiditia, saying that upon such occasions, and when they entertained strangers, it was not well to be too exact Laconians. After the table was removed, a stand was brought in with a brass vessel full of wine, 2 silver bowls, which held about a pint apiece, and a few silver cups, of which he that pleased might drink, but wine was not urged on any of the guests. There was no music, nor was any required, for he entertained the company himself, sometimes asking questions, sometimes telling stories, and his conversation was neither too grave or disagreeably serious, nor in any way rude or ungraceful in its pleasantry, for he thought those ways of entrapping men by gifts and presents which other kings used dishonest and artificial, and it seemed to him to be the most noble method, the most suitable to a king, to win the affections of those that came near him by personal intercourse and agreeable conversation. Since between a friend and a mercenary the only distinction is that we gain the one by one's character and conversation, the other by one's money. When soldiers, pay them well, but that it shouldn't be about the, it's a better job than a lot of people are capable of getting. The Mantineans were the first that requested his aid, and when he entered their city by night, they aided him to expel the Achaean garrison and put themselves under his protection. And as a side note, politicians too. Politicians should be doing what they do regardless of whatever wealth and whatnot comes to them. He restored them to their polity and laws, and the same day marched to Tegea, and a little while after, fetching a compass through Arcadia, he made a descent upon Phera in Achaia, intending to force Aratus to a battle, or bring him into disrepute for refusing to engage and suffering him to waste the country. Hyperbatus at that time was general, but Aratus had all the power amongst the Achaeans, marching forth with their whole strength, and encamping at Dama, near the Hecatombaum. Cleomenes came up, and thinking it not advisable to pitch between Dama, a city of the enemies, and the camp of the Achaeans, he boldly dared the Achaeans and forced them to a battle, and routing their phalanx, slew a great many in the fight, and took many prisoners, and thence marching to Langon and driving out the Achaean garrison, he restored the city to the Eleans. The affair of the Achaeans being in this unfortunate condition, Aratus, who was wont to take the office every other year, refused the command, though they entreated and urged him to accept it, and this was ill done, when the storm was high, to put the power out of his own hands, and set another to the helm. Cleomenes at first proposed fair and easy conditions by his ambassadors to the Achaeans, but afterwards he sent others, and required the chief command to be settled upon him in other manners offering to agree to reasonable terms and restore their captives and their country, the Achaeans were willing to come to an agreement upon those terms, and invited Cleomenes to Lerna, where an assembly was to be held. But it happened that Cleomenes, hastily marching on and drinking water at a wrong time, brought up a quantity of blood and lost his voice. Therefore, being unable to continue his journey, he sent the chiefest of the captives to the Achaeans, and putting off the meeting for some time, retired to Lacedaemon. A long time, but maybe he inhaled a bit of water or something. That was what happened. This ruined the affairs of Greece, which was just beginning in some sort to recover from its disasters, and to show some capability of delivering itself from the insolence and rapacity of the Macedonians. Or maybe he just put too much water on top of what he ate or something. For Aratus, whether fearing or distrusting Cleomenes, or envying his unlooked-for success, or thinking it a disgrace for him who had commanded 33 years to have a young man succeed to all his glory and his power, and be head of that government which he had been raising and settling so many years, first endeavored to keep the Achaeans from closing with Cleomenes, but when they would not hearken to him, fearing Cleomenes's daring spirit, and thinking the Lacedaemonians' proposals to be very reasonable, who designed only to reduce Peloponnesus to its own model, upon this he took his last refuge in an action which was unbecoming to any of the Greeks, most honorable to him and most unworthy his former bravery and exploits, for he called Antigonus into Greece, and filled Peloponnesus with Macedonians, whom he himself, when a youth, having beaten their garrison out of the castle of Corinth, had driven from the same country, and there had been constant suspicion and variance between him and all the kings, and of Antigonus in particular. He has said 1,000 dishonorable things in the commentaries he has left behind him, and though he declares himself how he suffered considerable losses and underwent great dangers that he might free Athens from the garrisons of the Macedonians, yet afterwards he brought the very same men armed into his own country and his own house, even to the women's apartment. He would not endure that one of the family of Hercules and king of Sparta, and one that reformed the polity of its country, and as it were from a disordered harmony, and returned it to the plain Doric measure, and the rule of life of Lycurgus, should be styled head of the Tritaeans and Sicaonians, and whilst he fled, the barley cake and coarse coat, and which were his chief accusations against Cleomenes, fleeing the barley cake and coarse coat. Can't think of the moment what the extirpation of wealth and reformation of poverty. He basely subjected himself, together with Achaia, to the diadem and purple, to the imperious commands of the Macedonians and their satraps, that he might not seem to be under Cleomenes. He offered sacrifices called Antigonea in honor of Antigonus, and sang pans himself with a garland on his head, to the praise of a wasted, consumptive Macedonian. I write this not out of any design to disgrace Aratus, for in many things he showed himself a true lover of Greece and a great man, but out of pity to the weakness of human nature, which in characters like this, so worthily and in so many ways disposed to virtue, cannot maintain its honors unblemished, by some envious fault. If you're worthy at one time, you're not necessarily going to be worthy at another time, right? So you got to be aware of what you're going to be tempted towards. The Achaeans meeting again in assembly at Argas, and Cleomenes, having came from Tegaa, there were great hopes that all differences would be composed, but Aratus, Antigonus, and he having already agreed that the chief articles of their league, fearing that Cleomenes would carry all before him and either win or force the multitude to comply with his commands, proposed that having 300 hostages put into his hands, he should come alone into the town and bring his army to the place of exercise called the Calorabium outside the city, and treat there. Cleomenes, hearing this, said that he was unjustly dealt with, for they ought to have told him so plainly at first, and not now he was coming even to their doors, show their jealousy, and deny him admission, and writing a letter to the Achaeans about the same subject, the greatest part of which was an accusation of Aratus, while Aratus, on the other side, spoke violently against him to the assembly. He hastily dislodged and sent a trumpeter to denounce war against the Achaeans, not to Argos, but to Aegium, as Aratus writes, that he might not give them notice enough to make provision for their defense. There had been a movement among the Achaeans themselves, and the cities were eager for revolt, the common people expecting a division of the land and a release from their debts, and the chief men being in many places ill-disposed to Aratus, and some of them angry and indignant with him for having brought the Macedonians into Peloponnesus. Encouraged by these misunderstandings, Cleomenes invaded Achaea, and first took Pellene by surprise, and beat out the Achaean garrison, and afterwards brought over Phaneus and Metelium to his side. Now the Achaeans, suspecting some treacherous designs at Corinth and Sicyon, sent their horse and mercenaries out of Argos to have an eye upon those cities, and they themselves went to Argos to celebrate the Nemean games. Cleomenes advertised of this march, and hoping, as it afterwards fell out, that upon an unexpected advance to the city, now busied in the solemnity of the games, and thronged with numerous spectators, he should raise a considerable terror and confusion amongst them by night, marched with his army to the walls, and taking the quarter of the town called Aspice, which lies above the theatre, well fortified and hard to be approached. So he terrified them that none offered to resist, but they agreed to accept a garrison, to give 20 citizens for hostage, and to assist the Lacedaemonians, and that he should have the chief command. This action considerably increased his reputation and his power, for the ancient Spartan kings, though they in many ways endeavored to effect it, could never bring Argos to be permanently theirs. And Parhus, the most experienced captain, though he entered the city by force, could not keep possession, but was slain himself with a considerable part of his army. Therefore they admired the dispatch and contrivance of Cleomenes, and those that before derided him for imitating, as they said, Solon and Lycurgus, in releasing the people from their debts, and in equalizing the property of the citizens, were now fain to admit that this was the cause of the change in the Spartans, for before they were very low in the world, and so unable to secure their own. that the Attalians invading Laconia brought away 50,000 slaves, so that one of the elder Spartans is reported to have said that they had done Laconia a kindness by unburdening it, and yet a little while after, by merely recurring once again to their native customs and re-entering the track of the ancient discipline, they were able to give, as though it had been under the eyes and conduct of Lycurgus himself, the most signal instances of courage and obedience, raising Sparta to her ancient place as the commanding state of Greece, and recovering all Peloponnesus. When Argos was captured and Cleomenes and Phlius came over, as they did at once, to Cleomenes, Aratus was at Corinth, searching after some who were reported to favor the Spartan interest. The news being brought to him disturbed him very much, for he perceived the city inclining to Cleomenes and willing to be rid of the Achaeans. Therefore he summoned the citizens to meet in the council hall, and slipping away without being observed to the gate, he mounted his horse that had been brought for him thither, and fled to Sicyon. And the Corinthians made such haste to Cleomenes at Argos, that, as Aratus says, striving who should be first there, they spoiled all their horses. He adds that Cleomenes was very angry with the Corinthians for letting him escape, and that Megastonus came from Cleomenes to him, desiring him to deliver the castle at Corinth, which was then garrisoned by the Achaeans, and offered him a considerable sum of money, and that he answered that matters were not now in his power, but he in theirs. Thus Aratus himself writes that Cleomenes, marching from Argos and taking in the Troezenians, Epidaurians, and Haemionaeans, came to Corinth and blocked up the castle, which the Achaeans would not surrender, and sending for Aratus's friends and stewards, committed his house and estate to their care and management, and sent Malus the Messenian to him a second time, desiring that the castle might be equally garrisoned by the Spartans and Achaeans, and promoting to Aratus himself double the pension that he received from King Ptolemy. But Aratus, refusing the conditions, and sending his own son with the other hostages to Antigonus, and persuading the Achaeans to make a decree for delivering the castle into Antigonus's hands. Upon this, Cleomenes invaded the territory of the Siconians, and by a decree of the Corinthians accepted Aratus's estate as a gift. In the meantime, Antigonus, with a very great army, and passing Chaeronea and Cleomenes, thinking it more advisable to fortify and garrison not the isthmus, not the isthmus, but the mountains called Onia, and by a war of posts and positions to worry the Macedonians, rather than to venture a set battle with the highly disciplined phalanx, put his design into execution, and very much distressed Antigonus, for he had not brought victuals sufficient for his army, nor was it easy to force a way through whilst Cleomenes guarded the pass. He attempted by night to pass through Lachaeum, but failed and lost some men, so that Cleomenes and his army were mightily encouraged, and so flushed with the victory that they went merrily to supper, and Antigonus was very much dejected, being driven by the necessity he was in to most unpromising attempts. He was proposing to march to the promontory of Heraeum, and thence transport his army and abouts to Sicyon, which, would take up a great deal of time, and require much preparation and means. But when it was now evening, some of Aratus's friends came from Argos by sea and invited him to return, for the Argives would revolt from Cleomenes. Aristoteles was the man that wrought the revolt, and he had no hard task to persuade the common people, for they were all angry with Cleomenes for not releasing them from their debts as they expected. Accordingly obtained 1,500 of Antigonus's soldiers. Aratus sailed to Epidaurus, but Aristoteles, not staying for his coming, drew out the citizens and fought against the garrison of the castle. Antimonus, with the Achaeans from Sicyon, came to his assistance. Cleomenes heard the news about the second watch of the night, and, sending for Megastonus, angrily commanded him to go and set things right at Argos. Megastonus passed his word for the Argives' loyalty, and had persuaded him not to banish the suspected. Therefore, dispatching him with 2,000 soldiers, he himself kept watch upon Antigonus and encouraged the Corinthians, pretending that there was no great matter in the commotions at Argos, but only a little disturbance raised by a few inconsiderable persons. But when Megastonus, entering Argos, was slain, and the garrison could scarce hold out, and frequent messengers came to Cleomenes for succors, he, fearing lest the army, having taken Argos, should shut up the passes and securely waste Laconia and besiege Sparta itself, which he had left without forces dislodged from Corinth, and immediately lost that city, for Antigonus entered it and garrisoned the town. He turned aside from his direct march, and assaulting the walls of Argos, endeavored to carry it by a sudden attack, and then, having collected his forces from the march, breaking into the Aspis, he joined the garrison, which still held out against the Achaeans. Some parts of the city he scaled and took, and his Cretan archers cleared the streets. But he saw Antigonus with his phalanx descending from the mountains into the plain, and the horse on all sides entering the city. He thought it impossible to maintain his post, and gathering together all his men, came safely down and made his retreat under the walls, having in so short a time possessed himself of great power, and in one journey, so to say, having made himself master of all Peloponnesus, and now lost all again in as short a time. For some of his allies at once withdrew and forsook him, and others not long after put their cities under Antigonus's protection. His hopes thus defeated, as he was leading back the relics of his forces, messengers from Lacedaemon met him in the evening at Tegea, and brought him news of as great a misfortune as that which he had lately suffered, and this was the death of his wife, to whom he was so attached and thought so much of her, that even in his most successful expeditions, when he was most prosperous, he could not refrain, but would every now and then come home to Sparta to visit Aegaetes. This news afflicted him extremely, and he grieved, as a young man would do for the loss of a very beautiful and excellent wife. Well, a few years go by, the beautiful and the rest of it doesn't quite hold the sway that it used to, but yet he did not let his passion disgrace him or impair the greatness of his mind, but keeping his usual voice, his countenance, and his habit, he gave necessary orders to his captains, and took the precautions required for the safety of Tegea. Next morning he came to Sparta, and having at home, with his mother and children, bewailed the loss and finished his mourning, he at once devoted himself to the public affairs of the state. Now Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, promised him assistance, but demanded his mother and children for hostages. And this for some considerable time he was ashamed to discover to his mother. And though he often went to her on purpose, and was just upon the discourse, yet he still refrained and kept it to himself, so that she began to suspect, and asked his friends whether Cleomenes had something to say to her, which he was afraid to speak. At last Cleomenes, venturing to tell her, she laughed aloud, and said, "Was this the thing that you had so often a mind to tell me, and were afraid? Make haste, and put me on shipboard, and send this carcass where it may be most serviceable to Sparta, before age destroys it unprofitably here." Therefore, all things being provided for the voyage, they went by land to Taenarus, and the army waited on them. Cratesiclea, when she was ready to go on board, took Cleomenes aside into Neptune's temple, and embracing him, who was much dejected and extremely discomposed, she said, "Go to King of Sparta. When we come forth at the door, let none see us weep or show any passion that is unworthy of Sparta, for that alone is in our own power. As for success or disappointment, those wait on us as the deity decrees." Having thus said and composed her countenance, she went to the ship with her little grandson, and bade the pilot put at once out to sea. When she came to Egypt, she understood that Ptolemy entertained proposals and overtures of peace from Antigonus, and that Cleomenes, though the Achaeans invited and urged him to an agreement, was afraid for her sake to come to any without Ptolemy's consent. She wrote to him, advising him to do that which was most becoming and profitable for Sparta, and not for the sake of an old woman and a little child, stand always in fear of Ptolemy. This character she maintained in her misfortunes. Antigonus, having taken Tegea and plundered Cleomenes and Mantinea, Cleomenes was shut up within the narrow bounds of Laconia, and, making such as of the Helots as could pay 5 Attic pounds free of Sparta, and by that means getting together 500 talents, and arming 2,000 after the Macedonian fashion, that he might make a body fit to oppose Antigonus's Eucaspides, he undertook a great and unexpected enterprise. Megalopolis was at that time a city of itself, as great as and as powerful as Sparta, and had the forces of the Achaeans and of Antigonus encamping beside it, and it was chiefly the Megalopolitans' doing that Antigonus had been called in to assist the Achaeans. Now, patience is not in giving up on emotions and thoughts, it's that you're still quick.